Chapter 8. I couldn't decide if I should go to dinner. I didn't want to face the other kids, and I guess I was secretly hoping that one of them would come knock on my door and apologize. It never happened. Instead, I lay on my bed, looking at the fake porthole while we broke orbit and headed to wherever the Granari homeworld was. At first I felt pathetic, but as I watched the moon and then Mars pass away, the wonder of it all made me momentarily forget how miserable my first day in space had been. Then an automated voice came over the speaker system. "Prepare to exit standard space." I was trying to decide how exactly you prepare for something like that when there was a flash of light, but in my mind, not on the screen. I experienced an instant of vertigo in which I felt like I was falling and flying and tumbling, even though I hadn't moved at all. Up and down were reversed, and I felt pressure as if my entire body were being squeezed down to the size of an egg, but also erupting out of my skin. The sensation was weird and vivid, but it only lasted for a fraction of a second. Meanwhile, the wall screen didn't so much as turn off as it vanished. Where there had been the simulation of a porthole seconds before, there was now just a blank wall. We were in hyperspace, or whatever it was, which meant that I was one of the first human beings to ever exceed the speed of light. I wanted so much to talk about this with someone, to toast this incredible achievement with intergalactic colas, but here I was, alone in my room. Soon after, I heard the door to the common room open, and the others talking and laughing, and worst of all, whispering. I lay there, trying to decide what would be worse, seeing them in the mess hall, or going without food. I decided to go without food for tonight. What would I do if I were at home, feeling lousy about my life? I laughed as I thought about it. Maybe I'd talk to my mom, but most likely I'd reach out for some science fiction to distract me. Now here I was, living the dream. And I wouldn't say that the dream stank, but it was certainly stinkier than I had hoped. I activated my data bracelet and began to search for games. Maybe I could take my mind off my woes with a little cool, high-tech diversion. These Confederation guys could build starships, run rings around the laws of physics, and construct machines that allow me to speak to creatures from other worlds. Their computer games would have to be immersive and thrilling. I had visions of being transported to realistic environments, swinging my 3D battle axe of doom. The sights and sounds, and maybe even smells of the game so vivid that they were indistinguishable from reality. As it turns out, being part of an advanced civilization does not guarantee your games won't be pathetic. I figured that out pretty quick. And I also learned that I was hooked up to the ship's network, which could have been why there wasn't much to choose from. But even so, I was unimpressed. There was a bunch of basic board and peg, stone and token games, the cultural equivalent of chess from a few dozen worlds. I saw the one with the cubes that Niana had been playing, Strategic Adumbrations, and though the text assured me it was one of the most popular games in the Confederation, it looked as dry as dust to me. It was all about deep strategy, thinking multiple moves ahead, and it felt more like work than fun. I found a few slightly more compelling things, including a basic game based on the idea of spreading galactic culture to other worlds, and the mechanics were actually pretty similar to Settlers of Catan. There was also a game using tiles that had the strange title of Approximate Results from Endeavors. Each title had a monetary value, or was worth points, or could perform actions, which made it kind of like Dominion. And there was also a dueling element, which reminded me of Magic the Gathering. I spent about an hour playing against the computer, and then I went on to the shared network and played with someone by the codename Yistip for another hour or two. There was a chat function, but I felt too shy to activate it, so I never talked to this Yistip. Even so, I learned a few things about the game from him, or her, or it. After we played for another 2 hours, I went to sleep. A late night of gaming, just like at home. The next morning, I woke up early, a side effect of the longer day, I supposed. I was hungry from having skipped dinner the night before, and I wanted to avoid the self-impressed trio, so I threw on some clothes and went in search of breakfast. Using my data bracelet to guide me, I found the guest mess, a small room that had been set up with food that we were familiar with. Some canned fruit and bread and cheeses. It was nothing exciting, but it was edible. I had the feeling that they were going to great lengths to accommodate Earth's tastes. I hoped that when we got to the Confederation, there would still be food that looked like, well, food. I wolfed down a muffin and canned peaches and some OJ, and then got out of there before I ran into anyone who might be inclined to exclude me. And then, just before 0800, I followed the directions of my data bracelet, which projected a translucent yellow path onto my HUD, and then headed out to meet the captain. I made my way to a stairwell and up 3 flights. Then I stepped out onto the bridge, where I did some primitive planet gaping in wonder. It didn't look exactly like the bridge of a science fiction ship, but it was pretty close. Maybe a little less Enterprise and a little more space battleship Yamato. Captain Quassel sat in a chair in the center of the room, a table containing various instruments and screens, which she fussed with perpetually. About 10 feet in front of her was a series of consoles at which sat 4 aliens, and there were more workstations all along the walls. On the bulkhead directly across from the captain was a massive front screen depicting the forward view of the ship, and all around it were dozens of smaller screens showing various alternate views of machinery inside and outside the vessel. Scrolls of text, numerical readouts, and graphical displays scrolled by.
"Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," the captain said. "How do you like our ship?"
"It's pretty great," I said, absolutely meaning it.
"I like to think that we don't do too badly,"
she said, raising her trunk. Almost certainly a smile, I decided. Some of the aliens looked at me, or pointed ocular orbs, or waved sensory stalks in my general direction. I wanted to think I was being paranoid, but there was no getting around it. I heard the word random whispered several times. The captain turned to look at me.
"Where would you like to begin?"
What exactly was my most pressing question? I decided to start with the basics. How do we travel faster than light? I asked. She rose from her chair and walked me over to where an earthworm with limbs had a station.
"Mr. Zekel, would you care to explain to our guest about the propulsion system?"
"Sure thing," he said, his eye stalks jiggling distractingly when he spoke. "You understand the basic problems of approaching light speed in normal space." I told him I did, though my understanding was, as I had no doubt, limited by his standards. "We have conventional engines that allow us to accelerate to somewhere in the range of 1/4 light speed, though warnings go off like crazy once we hit velocities that risk incurring time dilation. For interstellar travel, the physics is quite complicated. There is some debate about whether we move at all, or if we actually just stay still while the universe moves around us. But we use technology that essentially allows us to punch holes in space-time and then navigate through the apertures we create. Right now, we're not technically in the universe, and we're not really moving faster than light, so we're safe from the effects of extreme speed." "So you create wormholes?" His eye stalks stopped jiggling and met my gaze, and he pressed one hand to his wormy body, an evident gesture of confusion. "Wormholes?" "Like passageways through space," I tried again. He thought about this for a moment, or perhaps his translator was compensating for the idea of worms, which might have struck close to home. Yes, I think so. We call it tunneling. You enter an opening, and then you come out at the determined location. It's not quite instantaneous, but the ship can traverse nearly 60 light years in the course of a standard day."
"Very concise,
Mr. Zekel," the captain said, taking me by the arm and moving me away from the station.
He used to explain for an hour, saying basically the same thing. He'd actually explain the equations to anyone who was polite enough not to walk away."
"Ma'am, the equations are very interesting," Zekel called as we walked away. The tour continued, and I spoke briefly to Wimlow, the stick insect communications officer, and then we went to the helm station, which was operated by a giant otter with a sharp and hooked beak.
"Miss Yistip," the captain said, "can you explain the basics functioning of the helm to Mr. Reynolds?
Maybe, the creature said, in a high and distinctively feminine voice,
if he promises me a rematch at approximate results from endeavors.
That was you? I couldn't suppress a smile.
It was me, she said. You're good for a beginner. If you'd like, you can meet me in the officer's lounge after 200 hours, and we can play a few rounds.
Yeah, I'd love that. The humans didn't much like me, but the beaked otter thought I was okay. After Yistip gave me a quick rundown of how the helm worked, we moved on to the weapons console. Sitting there was a short and squat being with large black eyes that had no irises. A decidedly hog-like snout protruded ungracefully from his face, and it had a pair of menacing tusks on either side. He was also covered with tough gray hide, and thick ropey hair like dreadlocks hung from his head.
Mr. Urch, the captain said, please show our guest how the weapons station works.
Do you have to use weapons often? I asked. I thought the Confederation was peaceful.
Oh, we are, the captain said, but not everybody else is.
Urch rose from his seat and gestured towards it. He was the same height as I was, but broad and muscular, and he held himself like he was struggling against the urge to commit unspeakable acts of violence.
Sit,
he said with a grunt. It seemed like doing what he said was a good idea, so I sat.
Let me show you a simulation.
He pressed a few buttons on the display console, and a grid appeared, green against the black background. The outlines of 2 enemy ships manifest on the right side of the panel, and on the side of the panel were multiple weapon sources, while data about distance, shielding, speed, and posture of the hostile craft scrolled by on the left.
Many ship functions are automated, he said, but in combat, all targeting and weapon discharges must be handled by a sentient.
The computer can't do it more accurately?
No,
he snapped, as though the question had offended him.
It is standard ship design to vent radiation exhaust, which distorts an enemy's sensor readings. There is no way to compensate. Targeting must be done by cruder means. It is not a task for all beings. To operate the weapons, you need a steady hand and a fierce heart.
One of the enemy ships turned and fired some sort of weapon at us. The left side of the screen relayed information on damage.
Here is an enemy ship. It will destroy us if we don't fight back,
Urch said with a grunt.
You tap on the ship to target a particular sector.
He placed a long clawed and strangely delicate finger on the ship, which immediately enlarged and broke down into a dozen hexagon-shaped marks, each with data like life support or engines or command. He tapped the engines.
You then choose your weapon. The phased particle beam, or PPB, the dark matter missile, or the plasma lance.
He tapped the PPB button. Then, when the word commit appeared on the screen, he tapped that. A mock beam fired at the ship, and there was a simulated explosion on the screen. The ship was crippled. No offense, I said, but that looks kind of easy.
We are in teaching mode, he snorted. Real combat is fast and chaotic and messy. Achieving a weapons lock is challenging. Do you want to try a more lifelike simulation?
Well, sure, I said. He then pressed a few more buttons.
See what you can do, random.
The screen cleared for a moment, and then blinked back to life. 3 enemy vessels appeared on the screen, and they were all turning to fire at me. It was, in fact, fast and chaotic and messy. Damage reports scrolled down the side of the screen faster than I could read them. The ship itself moved constantly, and when I reached out to touch it, it was already gone. I tried again, this time anticipating the movement and targeting the weapon system. I then considered the relative merits of my 3 weapon choices, but since I had no knowledge of what each did, I wasn't sure which way I wanted to go. And while I tried to make up my mind, the screen informed me that I had been destroyed.
Not so easy,
Urch said with a grunt. Can I try again? I asked.
I see you like to lose,
Urch told me. I did not actually like to lose. However, I started to feel like I understood the system a little better. The setup reminded me of much more complicated and unforgiving versions of the minigames you sometimes find in science fiction, action, or role-playing games. I'm not saying that playing video games somehow trained me for real space combat, like it did in the classic film The Last Starfighter, but I didn't feel entirely lost either. When the simulation began, I focused immediately on the weapon system of the first ship and fired at it with the PPB, which missed. I still didn't know what the difference between the weapons was, but I knew that that one worked, and it was good enough for now. The ship flitted across my screen, making it difficult to get a weapons lock, but I saw a pattern to the movement after a moment, and the third time I tried, I was able to jump to an instant before it shifted position. I obtained a lock and fired the PPB, and then immediately targeted the weapon system of the two other ships. It took a few tries, but I was able to cripple their offensive capabilities before my ship took too much damage. Then I quickly fired on their life support system of each ship. The computer informed me that the enemy forces were requesting terms for surrender. I looked up at Urch and grinned. "Easy," I said. He grunted. The captain looked at the monitor.
"Not bad, Mr. Reynolds. The computer gives you a 67% efficiency rating. What is your rating, Mr. Urch?"
He scowled at me.
"In actual combat situations, I'm rated a 64%. It is a greater challenge when there are lives depending on you."
Realizing that I had just possibly made an enemy of a crazed boar creature who had claws on his fingers and whose main function on the ship was to kill people, I thought it might be a good idea to retrench. I rose and held up my hands in surrender. "I know, you're right. Anyhow, it was just beginner's luck." He locked his diabolical black eyes on my far less diabolical green ones.
"Luck," he said, "runs out."
The captain led me away before I could make any more enemies and mess up my situation on the ship any worse than it already was. We toured the rest of the ship, and if it proved less interesting, it was still great to get a better sense of where things were and how they worked. I dragged things on as long as possible because I didn't want to have to go back to my bunk and lie there with nothing to do except avoid the other humans, and now the angry weapons officer. The captain was obviously busy, but when she dropped me off at my door, she eyed me with concern. If I interpreted her hammerhead expression correctly.
"If you like, you can come back tomorrow, and we can pick up the granary. It won't be that exciting, but you will get to see the bridge officers engage in their duties as we drop into and then out of relativistic space. Learning how starships work has its advantages, if you know what I mean."
I didn't know what she meant, and she must have understood my blank expression.
"Take a look at your experience points," she said.
I made an effort to see the readout at the bottom left of my HUD, and there it was. And now it read 1014 out of 1000. My tour had earned enough experience points for me to level up. I broke into a grin. "Nice," I said. "I'll be there tomorrow." She put one of her heavy hands on my shoulder and locked onto my face with her huge, wide-set eyes.
"I know the random can be made to feel isolated," she said. "Trust me when I tell you that you do not have to be limited by the others in your delegation. You will find many opportunities to contribute.